vuelta ahora con un panel súper interesante.
I'm back
Como
here
vieron,
with a
ya
really
tuvimos un
interesting
primer
panel.
día
As you see,
completo
our first day
dedicado
was a complete
fundamentalmente
day
a temas
which
de
was
infraestructura.
dedicated to
Ahora vamos a ir
infrastructure.
poco a poco
And now we'll
moviéndonos hacia
be
temas que tienen más
moving
que ver con
on to
contenido, con
issues which
datos,
have more to
y
do with
después más
content
hacia
and
temas de
data,
impacto social.
and then looking at issues which have a
Ahora les
greater
tengo que
social
presentar un tema
impact.
súper
And now
importante que es
I'd like
privacidad
to
y
present
gobernanza de
a
datos,
very interesting issue,
tanto
which
de
is data
perspectivas
governance
regionales como
privacy,
globales.
new
Mucho ha
global
pasado
and
durante la
regional
pandemia en
perspectives.
relación al uso de datos.
A
Hemos
lot has
visto
happened
una
about data
variedad de
use during the
aplicaciones que
pandemic
nos
as we
pedían
saw a different
datos para
variety
saber
of
si estábamos bien de salud,
applications.
para saber si teníamos que
Lots of
estar
data
en
was requested from
cuarentena o
us.
no.
People wanted to know
Hemos
how our
visto
health status
una
was,
dudas por
whether
parte
we
de
were
la
respecting
población de saber
quarantine.
qué es lo que se iba a
And
hacer
there
con
were lots
esos
of
datos.
issues
Una
that
gran
came
cantidad
up.
de
What
sitios
was
web
going to be
que
done with
informaban
those
sobre
data?
COVID y no
There were lots of
necesariamente tenían
websites were
información
giving
correcta. Algunos
COVID
de ellos sí
information,
y
but there might
otros
not have been
eran
the right
sitios para
information.
quizás
And
capturar
others were sites which
personas
were
y
simply
capturar datos
being
personales de
used
gente que sin
to
querer
gather
iba a parar ahí.
personal
Así que el
data
tema de la
from
gobernanza de
people
datos es
who
súper
hadn't
importante.
necessarily given
Y ahora les quiero
their
presentar a nuestros
okay.
panelistas.
So without further
Y
ado, I'd
tengo
like to
a Pablo
present our
Segura, gran amigo de la
panelists.
escuela,
Pablo Segura, who
que
is a
es
great
el director
friend
de
of
Data
our
Privacy de
school,
Mercado Libre,
the
una empresa
Data
muy
Privacy
importante para
Director of
Argentina y
Mercado
para América
Libre.
Latina. Bienvenido, Pablo. Tengo a Jimena
Welcome, Pablo.
Moreno,
And we
profesora
have
del CIDE de
Jimena Moreno,
México.
who
Bienvenida,
is a
Jimena.
professor from the
Y
Center
nos
for
va
Research and
a moderar
Teaching
el
in
panel
Economics
Paola
in Mexico,
Restrepo de Colombia,
and
que es
Paola
presidenta
Restrepo
ejecutiva
from
de Mujeres
Colombia,
de
the
Colombia.
Executive President of
Bienvenidos todos,
ICT
les
Women
agradecemos
Colombia, will be
muchísimo
moderating the
que estén
panel.
aquí con
Welcome,
nosotros.
everybody.
Estamos con 500 becarios de
Today
todo el
we
mundo. Tengo
have
saludos de acá de la
500
India, de todos lados, porque
participants
como
from
tenemos
all over the
traducción
world with
simultánea
greetings
y en
from
la
India, and
virtualidad,
thanks to the fact
la
that we
escuela que
have
antes era muy
simultaneous
latinoamericana,
translation
ahora sigue
and
siendo latinoamericana,
virtuality,
pero se ha expandido
our school
a
can
otras
expand
fronteras y
around
el
the
tema de la
world.
traducción simultánea también lo
And
permite.
obviously
Les
the issue
agradezco
of
mucho que
simultaneous
estén con
translation
nosotros
helps a
y
great
les
deal.
recuerdo que un poco el moto general de la
So
escuela este
the
año
general motto of our
es
school
el
this
uso
year
de Internet
is
como
how
herramienta de
internet was
recuperación
used
económica
as
después de
an
la pandemia
tool
de
for economic
COVID-19
recovery
con enfoque
post-pandemic,
latinoamericano, pero
with
también
a
con
focus on
perspectivas
Latin
globales. Les
America, but
agradezco
also
muchísimo que estén
perspective
con
from
nosotros
around the
y
world.
Paola,
Thank you for
te doy
being
la
with us.
palabra,
And
bienvenida y
Paola,
gracias por haber
over to
aceptado
you.
moderar este
Thank
panel.
you for agreeing to be with us.
Olga, Pablo, Jimena, muy buenos días.
Olga, Pablo, Jimena, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here in this panel, especially addressing this important issue of privacy and internet governance. We're going to discuss this important issue that has become an asset for corporations and for all kinds of entities. The use of this data becomes information and also know-how that is so valid for decision making. That's why we have worldwide experts in this panel. I'm going to introduce Jimena Moreno, professor of CIDE from Mexico, and Pablo Segura, data privacy director from Mercado Libre. And I'm going to kickstart with this with a question, so they can address their own presentations and discuss the internet governance models, rolling data of every single country to see if there were changes along these years and their opinions in terms of internet governance or data governance. Jimena, over to you. Can you share your presentation from there? Yes, thank you, Paola. My acknowledgements to Olga Cavalli. It's an honor to be here. Pablo, it's a pleasure. It's going to be very important, especially addressing market issues, academia, and the public sector. I would like to screen my PowerPoint presentation. I have 10 minutes, right? Yes, 10 minutes each to take then questions in the Q&A session. Can you see the screen from there? Yes. Good. Okay, I'm going to start by way of introduction, addressing the approach of privacy of what we're doing in Mexico and in other parts of the region. And first of all, I would like to present the state of the art or where we stand by addressing the approach of privacy from a different outlook. Okay, it's not that we're going to leave data protection aside, because these are fundamental rights, human rights, and they're protected as such by regulations or by countries. But there's been an increase in development in technology of the social and economic process that is related to the exchange of global goods and services. Data, personal data are goods. Some of them are considered public goods, and some of them are subject to discussion if whether they're public goods or not. But it's a good start discussing that privacy has been changing the way that we are gathering this data, how we use them, how we refer to them, and how they are exchanged. So privacy from the point of view of human right as protection right now changed more or less the outlook, and we know how in this way we are dealing with in the way we treat this private data. And this is the new trend. Okay, there's a balance to be stricken between the digitalization of what we do in our daily lives. And as a matter of fact, yesterday, some of the panelists explained some examples with losses of $161 million per hour across the world. Imagine digitalization is here to stay right now, and is the major issue today, especially Telegram, Facebook, etc. Imagine that yesterday there was a drop in the stock exchange because of those stocks of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. So nobody is essential, nobody is indispensable in this new era. And at the end of the day, what we have to see is to strike a balance between the digitalization of private data, privacy, and the security of people. And here we include the commercial, the financial part, the mobility aspect, or how we store this data, because data by themselves do not mean anything, but they imply creating public policy, better decision making in corporations, etc. So treating private data right now acquires new dimensions. So what I would like to discuss right now is including personal data exchange and how this is seen nowadays, applying some principles in line with human rights. So we need to conceive the principles of legality, transparency, because transparency today has become key on how we are going to use those users' data from the financial, commercial, and business point of view, and to the end that these data are going to be used. So we have to reinforce those issues of confidentiality and data storage as well. So there's a paradigm shift in all those information integration processes, and the stakeholders require this exchange of data in order to protect the way we store this privacy of personal data. There's not an international process on how we are going to develop a new governance model that would allow big data, metadata, especially personal data. So with the big data issue, we cover that, and ensuring also data protection and privacy. Europe, for example, has been discussing the internet governance or the data governance law, where they try to create a new idea of privacy and data governance. So I believe that is important to see how technologically wise we are trying to protect privacy, either like, for example, design privacy, not to lose sight of data protection and people's privacy and to still protect this. So e-commerce, cloud computing, and other tools allow for data personal transfer that right now is unprecedented. The use of big data is unparalleled. We live in a global era that we're faced with this interoperability of data and data exchange, and the pandemic exacerbated this because the exchange between pharmaceuticals, countries, and corporations created data exchange that has been unparalleled. And we're going to build what is coming in order to protect data privacy or the use of data, and we have to create for that new protection legislation in internet governance because we're falling short of legislation and laws. As it always happens, technology goes faster than legislation can keep up with. So national regulations and international regulations on privacy, they become lags in connection with technology developments. So as far as I can see, the value of information has changed, has increased when we gather non-traditional data, creating indeed information. Non-traditional data are those data that do not come from the government or from registrars, but from corporations, from local convenience stores, e-commerce, and the like. That creates very valuable information indeed, and it's readily available information for decision making that is so significant. So the issue is that we are starting to see that this has changed. One way of protecting anonymity of information given this data exchange is that there are some loopholes or problems. So we need to think creatively to come up with a new solution. Companies and corporations need to take this into account in its administration because we deal with the administrative or the private part, and we need to drive the necessary procedures that manage this sort of information and that guarantee confidentiality. We are starting to see how in the internal process of corporations the use of this data needs to follow a physical order for this internet governance to protect the human rights and the privacy rights of people, because this is mandated by law in line or according to international law. So, confidentiality standards should be created to create trust between the user and the user and the person, the recipient of those data. It's not only the users that use this information, but also sometimes we lose useful information, for example, strategic data from corporations on the government, because there are many, increasingly more players that have personal data, and confidentiality standards are required in order to protect that personal data. It's not that we have a paradigm shift. It's not only gathering data, but there are many regulations in how to gather these data, and the idea of personal data and all of that and that is very, very important. But gathering should aim at the way we are going to protect data, its treatment, its use, and the new trends in the market is that now people are empowered to control the information they have. So we have seen empowerment in connection with their own personal data. And the legal framework that regulates this is lagging behind. So the consent systems or the NDAs cannot protect these data governance any longer. So the focus of responsibility should be changed, not only allowing access to data, but the recipient or the one that shares this data should be regulated, also to strengthen the custody of this data, because this implies specific responsibilities, sanctions, and penalties when misusing this information. And this is key. In order to conclude my remarks, let me tell you that we have seen how users in social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, sometimes consent in sharing this privacy, and these institutions, public and private institutions alike, use this data. That is why the issue of privacy is kind of overwhelmed, because we signed a consent form in opening our data. So the governments and companies should keep the confidentiality and protect the personal data that has been provided, subject to the objectives and mandate of human rights. So this is part and parcel of the exchange of data that we are providing the other party. Thank you very much. Jimena, thanks a lot. You have been very, very clear in connection with the way we share this with third parties, caring for privacy and transparency, without losing sight of that private or personal information that we do need. I'll give the floor to Pablo. Pablo, can you share your presentation? Can you screen? You have 10 minutes.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Paola.
Thank you very much, Paola.
Me sumo a los agradecimientos de Jimena,
I
la
would
organización,
also
a Olga
like
en
to
particular,
thank
y
Olga
desde ya
especially
a
and all the
mis
team
compañeros
involved in
panel,
organizing this, as well as my
que es un honor
panel
para mí estar
colleagues.
acá compartiendo
It's an honor to
experiencias
be here, sharing my
hablar sobre un tema que
experiences,
me apasiona tanto como
and
es
it is
la
a
privacidad
subject I find truly
y los
fascinating,
programas de privacidad
privacy and privacy
específicamente.
programs
Voy a
specifically.
compartir mi
So I'm
pantalla
going
ahora.
to share my screen now.
Creo que ya se debe estar viendo.
You should be able to see it.
Y voy a hablar, voy a retomar algunos de los conceptos
And I'm
que
just going to
recién
touch on
expuso
the
Jimena
concepts that
muy
Jimena was
claramente
talking
y
about very
de una
clearly.
manera muy al punto, para
She
avanzar un
really
poquito
did
más
get to the
sobre
point there.
cómo
And
las organizaciones,
I
tanto
want
del
to go
sector
into
privado, del sector
how
público,
private and public
pueden
sector
avanzar para
organizations can
cumplir con las regulaciones y
move
además
ahead
proteger la
to
privacidad
comply with
de
regulations
sus
and
usuarios,
protect
de los
user
habitantes, de
privacy,
los administrados,
privacy of
depende del
those who
tipo de
have been
organización y
administrated.
la
It depends
categoría
very
del
much
titular
on
del
the
dato,
kind of
para que puedan hacerlo
organization
no
and
solamente
the
por una
owner of the
cuestión de
data.
cumplimiento
But this
regulatorio,
is not merely for the
sino
sake
además
of regulatory
como
compliance,
una manera
but
de
also as a
generar
way
confianza en el uso de la
of
información
fostering trust in the
y
way information is
también
going to be
proteger uno de
used
los activos más importantes
and
con que
to
hoy cuenta
protect
cualquier
one of the most
organización, que es
important assets any
los datos
organization
personales
has, which are
de
personal
tanto sus
data
usuarios o sus administrados
belonging
en el
either to
caso
their
de la
users
administración pública.
or their
Voy
people who they are administrating.
a remarcar
So
la vinculación muy
I
muy
want
grande
to
que existe
talk
entre
about
la
the close
tecnología y
relationship between
la protección de los datos
technology,
personales, que ya
personal data
estuvo tocando el
protection,
tema Jimena en su presentación.
which Jimena has already touched upon in
Por
her
hoy, ya
presentation.
prácticamente
Today,
podemos decir que la
we can
tecnología
say that
es
technology
la manera más importante de relacionarnos con el mundo
is the
exterior.
most important
Esta
way we
foto de marca que
have
ya no
of relating
miramos
with
a
the
nuestros
outside
ídolos
world.
con nuestros propios ojos, sino lo hacemos a
We
través
don't look at
de
our
un
idols with our own
dispositivo
eyes anymore,
digital.
but through a
Y
digital
de la misma
device.
manera en que
And
estamos
in the
nosotros todo
same
el tiempo
way
tratando de capturar
in which
momentos y el
we are
mundo en
constantly trying to
general
capture
mediante dispositivos
Kodak
digitales,
moments
también
using
esto
digital
ocurre
devices
a
of
una
our
escala
lives and the
masiva.
world around us.
Entonces cada
This
vez más
happens at a
es la
more
tecnología la que percibe el
overall
mundo
way
y los
because
humanos a través
technology
de
is
la tecnología,
perceiving the
pero
world
cuando la
and
tecnología
humans
percibe el mundo,
perceive the
también está
world
percibiendo
through
a personas y
technology.
también está
But
recolectando
when
datos
technology
personales y esto
perceives
genera
the world,
un
it is
montón de
also
nuevos
collecting
desafíos
personal
a
data, which
la
brings
protección
us face to
de los
face
datos
with a
personales
number of
que
challenges
tenemos
about
que estar
data
atentos. Entonces,
privacy, and
una
we have to be
vinculación
on
muy
top of
importante que
this.
tenemos que tener en
So
cuenta es la
there's
tecnología, la
a
protección de
close
datos y lo que
relationship
genera
between
la necesidad de
technology and
regular
data
el
protection and the
uso de los
need
datos
to
personales para
regulate
evitar
personal data
que,
use.
además de los aspectos positivos que vamos a ver que
So,
tiene la
as in
tecnología,
addition to the
también
positive
se ven esos
aspects of
aspectos negativos
technology,
que
there
aparecen
are some negative
principalmente en la
ones,
forma de desafíos
which we see
a la privacidad.
specifically in challenges to
Quiero hacer un
personal
pequeño
privacy.
paneo y
So
mostrarles
I want
que
to start with a
hoy en el
brief
mundo es una
overview
preocupación
of the situation in the
de
world
la mayoría
today.
de los países
It is a concern in most
que
countries,
ya han sancionado una ley general de protección de
which
datos
we
personales. Como
have
pueden
the
ver
General
ahí,
Data
los
Protection
países que están en
Regulation,
azul
as you
son
can
los que
see.
tienen una ley
Countries
sancionada de
in
protección de
blue
datos.
have
Y si a eso le
a
sumamos los que están
law
en rojo, que son aquellos que
enacted
tienen un
about this,
proyecto
and those
avanzado
in red
de
have a
regulación de
bill which
protección de
is
datos, nos vamos a dar cuenta
underway
que
as a data protection
la gran
regulation.
mayoría de los países
But
en el mundo
most
tienen una
countries in the world
regulación de
do
protección de datos, lo que
have
nos dicen
some
que
way of
estamos,
protecting
cuando
data.
hablamos de
But
trabajar de
when we
procesar datos
talk
personales,
about processing
vamos a
personal
sumergirnos en un
data,
marco regulatorio que es
we
cada vez más
get
complejo porque cada vez
enmeshed
son
in
más
a
las
very
regulaciones
complex
que
regulatory
protegen los
framework
datos
because
de
there
las
are many
personas y por
different
lo tanto
kinds
si
of
una
data
organización
protection regulations.
trabaja,
And
presta
organizations are
servicios
working
o
and
vende
providing
bienes o
services,
trasciende las
selling
fronteras de su país
assets,
de
but they go
origen, va a estar
beyond their
sometido a una
country
regulación
borders and thus will be subject
a más de una regulación de protección de
to
datos y vas a tener
more
que estar
than
atento y vas a
one
tener que
data
incorporar
protection
esas
regulation.
distintas
So
regulaciones
they
dentro
have
de
to
su programa
incorporate all of these different
de
regulations within
privacidad.
their own
Y
privacy
también, como
programs.
mencionó
And
Jimena,
as Jimena said earlier,
el ámbito regulatorio es cada vez más
the
complejo
regulatory
porque la
environment is
regulación tiene
becoming
que seguir la
increasingly
tecnología.
complex as regulatory
Y
has to follow in the
esto
steps
quiere
of
decir
technology.
que
It has to keep pace, in
no es lo
fact.
mismo una regulación de
It's
protección de
not the
datos que se
same to
sanciona en
talk
el año
about
2000
a
como ocurre
data
con la ley
protection
argentina.
regulation law
Si nosotros
approved
pensamos
in
cómo nos
2000
conectábamos a
as a
internet desde el
law
año 2000,
covering
¿se
what's
acuerdan
happening now?
con el
If you
teléfono, a
remember,
través de la
in
línea de teléfono?
Argentina,
Y cuando uno se
there was the
conectaba, tenía
telephone line
probablemente
law, and when
problemas familiares porque
you
estaba ocupando
called
la línea
somebody
de
on the
teléfono,
telephone,
que era la
when
forma
back
de
in the old
comunicarse
days, you know, if you
principal,
called
la línea
somebody,
fija
you
de
might have a
teléfono,
problem
que
with
era
your
la forma de
family because you were
comunicarse
using the
con el
phone
resto del
line, and
mundo.
that was
Entonces, las
everybody's
conexiones a
only
internet eran
way
muy cortas. Bueno,
of connecting
con
to
esta
the world.
realidad
So connection
tecnológica
was quite
es que se
limited.
sancionó la ley de protección
But
de datos de Argentina,
the
una realidad tecnológica
General Data
completamente diferente.
Protection
No
Regulation
existía en
in
aquel momento la
Argentina was
computación en la
passed because
nube.
there was nothing
Por lo
before
tanto,
that. And there wasn't even
la
any cloud
regulación de
computing at
protección
that
de
point.
datos tiene
So
que hacer un
data
esfuerzo por
protection regulation
ayornarse
has
y
to
cuando no lo
be
hace,
updated.
los que
And when
tenemos que
this
hacer el
doesn't
esfuerzo somos
happen,
los que trabajamos en privacidad para
we
entender cómo
are the people that
en
need
las
to
nuevas
be making
realidades
sure this happens.
tecnológicas
Those of us
se
working in the
reinterpretan,
regulatory
las
organizations,
leyes
because
se
we need to
reinterpretan
make
a la luz
sure
de las nuevas
that the
realidades
laws can
tecnológicas
be
para entender cómo se
reinterpreted in the
aplica esa
light of
norma
new
que se
technology
sancionó
reality.
teniendo en cuenta una realidad
A law
tecnológica al
was
mundo
adopted
y a
in
la actualidad.
one particular
Entonces,
technological
tenemos
reality,
un
but
marco
now the
complejo, son
situation is
muchas las
very different.
regulaciones y un marco
So it's a very
dinámico.
complex
Las
framework, it's a very
regulaciones van
dynamic
evolucionando y si no
one.
evolucionan
Regulations
las
continue to
regulaciones nosotros
evolve,
las tenemos que interpretar de
and
una manera
reality evolves. And
dinámica.
if the regulations don't keep pace, we
Diciendo
have to
esto, tenemos
find
que
ways of
decir también que
interpreting
todo
them
este
in a
marco
dynamic
complejo
way.
mira
Now, this
mucho a lo que
complex
es Europa.
framework
Europa es una suerte de meca
tends to
en
take its
cuanto a
cue from
protección de
Europe, which is
datos
kind of the mecca when it comes to data
en
protection.
esa relación podemos decir que
And in that
el texto
sense,
sagrado, la Biblia
that
de la protección de datos
the
vendría a ser el
sacred
reglamento europeo
text
de
of
protección de
the
datos,
GDPR, which is the
porque
EU's regulation,
le elevó muchísimo la vara en cuanto a
it
protección
raised the
a los
bar
requisitos para
when it came
procesar la
to
información de
protecting
carácter
the
personal, en cuanto a
requirements
los
to
derechos que tiene las personas con
process
relación a los
personal
datos.
data.
Tiene un ámbito de aplicación
And
extraterritorial, entonces
it has an extra
por ahí una organización
extraterritorial environment
estando fuera de la
for
Unión Europea,
applying
ofrece
the
bienes y
rules to
servicios
people who are
a
within and
personas que se
without
ubiquen
the
dentro de la Unión
European
Europea, se
Union.
encuentra alcanzada
So the
también por la ley.
services are applied to
por el
people who are
reglamento
working within
europeo
the
y al
EU,
mismo tiempo
but at the same
ese
time,
reglamento europeo, la
the
sanción de ese
regulation
reglamento europeo tuvo un efecto
also
expansivo en el resto de las
extends
regulaciones
to
del mundo y
other
también
regulations in
en
other parts
Latinoamérica,
of the
por
world,
ejemplo.
including
En
Latin
Brasil se
America.
sancionó
In
la Ley
Brazil, for
General de
instance,
Protección de
there
Datos,
is
que
a
se la
general data
conoce
protection
como
regulation,
el
which
GDPR
is
brasilero, por tener un
known
estándar
as the
muy
Brazilian
similar a lo que
GDPR
ocurre.
because its standard is
Generó
very
también
similar to what is going on in
proyectos
Europe.
de reforma
There are
en
also
la República
bills to
Argentina, en
reform
Chile,
the current
en
laws in
Uruguay.
Argentina, Chile, and
También hay
Uruguay.
proyectos
And there
en
are
Colombia y en
draft
México
bills
tratando de elevar
underway
el
in
estándar
Colombia
de
and
protección
Mexico, which are
de
trying
datos
to
y
raise the
asimilarlo
data
al reglamento
protection
europeo. Entonces podemos
regulations and
decir que
assimilate them to the EU
el GDPR, si
GDPR.
bien no se aplica directamente
And although
en
this doesn't
Latinoamérica,
apply
sí tiene un
directly in
impacto
Latin
y
America, it certainly has
sí
an
tiene
impact
muchas repercusiones
and a great many
por estas latitudes.
repercussions because in this
Y
area, in this region.
el punto quizás más importante que
One
incorpora
of the
el
most
reglamento
important
europeo
points
al
it
mundo de la protección de
includes
datos, al
that the
mundo
GDPR is
del cumplimiento
introduced
de la protección de datos, es el
in terms of
accountability.
compliance
El
is
accountability, que es una palabra que
accountability.
tiene es muy
This
difícil de
word
traducirla al
is
castellano
really difficult to
porque no hay
translate
un
in
término que le haga
Spanish because
justicia.
there isn't really a
Podemos decir
single
de
term to do it
responsabilidad,
justice.
podemos
We
hablar de
could talk
rendición de
about
cuentas, podemos hablar de
responsibility, we could talk
compromiso,
about
pero
rendering
vamos a necesitar
accounts, we could
muchas
even
palabras
talk
para
about
poder
commitment,
hacerle
but we
justicia
need lots
a lo
of
que quiere decir el
words
término
to
accountability.
really interpret what
La
accountability
regulación,
means.
el proyecto de reforma en Argentina y en Chile lo
The
denominan
regulatory
responsabilidad
reform
proactiva, este
projects in
principio.
Argentina and
En
Chile
Colombia
are
es responsabilidad demostrada, lo
applicable
tiene en el
in a
decreto
reactive
reglamentario de la
sense.
ley.
There is a decree in
México, en el decreto
Argentina
reglamentario, lo llama directamente,
and
lisa y llanamente,
Mexico as
responsabilidad, el
well,
principio de
which talk
responsabilidad.
about the principle of
La
accountability.
ley general de protección de datos de Brasil,
The GDPR, the
el término que
Brazilian
utilizan
GDPR, uses the
responsabilización
term
y prestación de cuentas, que es algo
responsibility
así como
and
responsabilización y
protection
rendición de cuentas.
and
Y este
rendition of
concepto se está
accounts.
incorporando
And this is a
dentro de nuestra
concept
realidad
which has been
jurídica de
incorporated
Latinoamérica
into
y que
our
implica
rule of
un
law
cambio de
in
paradigma,
Argentina
porque
and
antes
in
uno
Latin
cumplía con la
America. And it is
regulación
a
de
change
protección
in
de datos
paradigm because
cumpliendo los
before
requisitos, haciendo un
people
checklist,
used to
terminaba
comply
de
with the
cumplir con el checklist y
requisites
uno se
by
olvidaba de protección
drawing
de
up a
datos hasta el
checklist, you
siguiente
ticked off all the
requerimiento de la autoridad de
boxes,
control. Y ese era
and
todo
that was
el
pretty much
cumplimiento
it.
que uno necesitaba, es
And
cumplir
that was
con
pretty much
una
all the
serie de
compliance
requisitos y no
required. You
olvido.
just ticked off the
En
boxes
cambio,
and that was
cuando
that.
estoy en el ámbito de la
But
responsabilidad
when
proactiva o
you
la
are talking
accountability,
about
yo tengo que
accountability,
demostrar no
I
solamente que
have to
cumplo
be
la
able
norma,
to
sino la
show
manera
that
en la
I'm
que
not
estoy
only
cumpliendo la norma.
complying
Tengo
with
que
the
demostrar que ese
standards, but
cumplimiento
how
es
I'm
efectivo
doing
y que
this.
redunda en un
I have to show
beneficio
it's
para
effective
los particulares. Entonces yo no
and
puedo
that
cumplir
it
meramente el
impacts
requisito.
on
Yo
all
no puedo solamente decir,
participants.
bueno,
It's not a
yo
question
tengo el
of
requisito
just
de tener
checking
un
off
aviso
the
de privacidad en mi
boxes.
página,
For
acá está
instance, I have a
cumplido y ya
privacy
ya
statement
no
on
me
my
cabe más
page,
ningún
and
incumplimiento
so I
porque
don't
tengo
have to do anything more about
ese
that.
requisito cumplido. Yo tengo que demostrar cómo
But I
ese aviso
also
de
have to be
privacidad
able
es
to
claro,
show
le
how
es
that
útil
privacy
al
statement
destinatario,
it actually
tengo
is
que demostrar
useful
cómo
to the users
le brinda un valor,
and
le agrega
how it
valor
adds
al titular
value
del dato
to
el
people who own
cumplimiento. Y
the
además tengo que
data
demostrar que
with
cómo
compliance.
yo
And
estoy
I have to be able
protegiendo
to
los derechos
show I am
de los
protecting
titulares de la
the rights
información.
of
Entonces,
information owners.
esto me obliga a
So
las
this
organizaciones a tener un
obliges
programa de privacidad, a tener una
organizations to
acción
have
estratégica
privacy
de protección de datos, a
programs
tener un trabajo
and a
continuo interno de la organización
strategic
que les
data
permita
protection
demostrar que está
activity
protegiendo la
and to be
privacidad
able to show
de
how
los
they are
titulares de la
protecting
información
people's privacy.
cuyos datos procesa. Y esto implica que yo
This
tengo que demostrar
implies
cómo
that we have to
cumplo
show
con las
how
obligaciones,
we are
que yo tengo
complying with our
documentados cuáles son
obligations
todos los
and
tratamientos,
document
las
all
actividades
the
de
different
tratamiento de datos y
treatments
los activos
of the
de
data
información,
and the
que
information assets
cumplo con el principio de privacidad desde el diseño,
and
esto es
comply
involucrar el análisis
with
de privacidad
privacy
desde la concepción misma de
from
un nuevo
the
producto, de una nueva
concept of
iniciativa,
a
de
new
un nuevo
product and
servicio,
initiative,
que tengo
a new
nombrado una
service,
persona, un funcionario que
that
está
I have
pensando el 100% de su tiempo en
delegated
privacidad, como es el
somebody
delegado
who
de
is
protección de datos, el oficial
dedicated
de
to
protección
data
de datos,
privacy.
que
It
realizo
could be a data
evaluaciones de impacto,
privacy
esto
officer
es, analizo a las
who
nuevas iniciativas antes de
analyzes
pasarlas a
new
producción,
initiatives
en cómo va a
before they go
impactar
into
sobre la
production
privacidad de
and
los
looks at
usuarios
how
de
they will
esa
impact on
aplicación o de
user
esa iniciativa,
privacy.
y por último que reporto los
And
incidentes de
lastly,
seguridad
who reports on
cuando
any
ocurren a la
security
autoridad
incidents when they
y
happen
a
to the
el afectado
authorities
por
and to those
ese incidente
affected.
de seguridad. Para terminar, solamente
To
contarles
finish,
que
I should
desde
just
Mercado
say
Libre nosotros
that
tenemos
at Mercado
implementado un programa de
Libre, we
protección de
have
datos cuya
implemented a data
idea
protection
fuerza es
program
crear valor mediante el uso
which
responsable de los
aims
datos
to
personales. Esto
create
es,
value
nosotros no,
through the
como
responsible
dije al
use
principio,
of
nosotros no nos
personal
tomamos
data.
al programa
This is
de
not
protección de datos como un mero programa de cumplimiento
It's
regulatorio.
not simply
Para
a
nosotros es una
compliance, a
forma de
regulatory
generar valor.
compliance program,
Generar
but a
valor
way
para
of
nuestros
generating
usuarios
value
porque le
for our
permitimos operar en
users
una
because we're
plataforma
allowing them
confiable,
to use a
confidencial
safe,
y segura. Y
confidential
también crear valor para
platform
la propia organización, para el propio
and
Mercado
also
Libre.
creating
¿Por
value
qué?
for
Porque le da una
our
ventaja
own
competitiva,
organization because this
porque
gives us a
lo hace un
competitive
ciudadano
edge
corporativo responsable,
because
porque lo hace
we
un aliado
are
comercial
perceived as
confiable
a
y porque
responsibly
es un
social,
agente,
socially
lo
responsible
transforma en un agente
company,
multiplicador de
and
cultura de
because it
protección
turns
de
us
datos. Porque
into a
nosotros, así como
multiplier
nosotros
of
tenemos un
data
programa de
protection
protección,
actions.
también le
We
exigimos,
have a
por
protection
ejemplo, a
program, and we
nuestros
require
proveedores que
our
también tengan un
suppliers
estándar
to also
de
have
protección
data
de la
protection
información. Con lo cual,
standards.
mediante un programa de privacidad, y este es el mensaje que
So
quiero brindar,
this is the message I want
eh,
to convey
se
to you.
genera valor
We are
para la
creating value
propia organización. Entonces no estamos
for the
simplemente
organization.
cumpliendo
It's
un
not
programa,
just about
un
complying
requisito regulatorio,
with a
sino que estamos
regulatory
generando
requirement,
valor
but
para la
creating
organización y
value
para toda la
for the
sociedad.
organization and for
Muchísimas
society
gracias
as a whole. Thank you very
por la
much.
atención y quedo atento a las preguntas.
And I'll happy to take
Pablo,
any
muchas
questions.
gracias.
Pablo, thank you
Sí,
so much.
arrancamos con las preguntas en áreas del
Let's
tiempo.
start with the
Yo
questions.
quisiera aprovechar que Pablo tiene ahí su micrófono
Pablo,
encendido aún para preguntarte.
I wanted
Hemos
to
hablado
ask
que
you
gracias, digamos, a todo el tema de la pandemia se han aumentado
that
los nuevos datos, las nuevas tecnologías.
because of the
Necesitamos
pandemic, data
nuevas
use has
gobernanzas de datos.
increased.
Yo
We need
quisiera
new data
preguntarte
governance
qué
measures.
desafíos crees tú que
What
enfrentan estas
challenges
entidades
do
públicas y
you
privadas en el
think that
tratamiento
public
de
and
datos para
private entities
garantizar
dealing with data
la
processing
privacidad y
are
cómo
facing in
enfrentarlo?
order to protect privacy?
Ah,
What do they need to do?
Buenísimo, muy buena
That's a
pregunta,
really good
Paola. Vamos
question.
a tratar de responderla lo más sucintamente
Let's
posible.
see how we can
Las organizaciones a
provide you
partir
with
de
a
la pandemia
short
empezaron a
answer.
enfrentar un montón de
As from
desafíos
the
diferentes.
pandemic, the
Tuvieron
entities
que
started to
atender
face
la
lots of
crisis y la
different
continuidad o del
problems. They had
negocio
to
o de las
deal with
políticas en el caso de
business
que sea
continuity.
políticas públicas,
They
en el
had
caso de que
to
sea
deal with the
una
continuity
organización, una
of drawing
autoridad
up
pública.
public policy in the case
Se
of
tuvieron que
public
adaptar
entities.
a las nuevas
And they
demandas y
had
a
to
las
adapt
conductas
to
de las
new
personas que
demands and
adoptaron
new
en la
behaviors
pandemia.
adopted by people
Empezó
during the pandemic.
a trabajarse muchísimo, se empezó a
People
trabajar
started
desde la
working
casa, a
from
consumir
home.
a través
People started
de Internet,
consuming
dando un salto muy
more
importante en lo que
through
fueron
internet. This was a
las
fairly
ventas,
important qualitative and
las ventas
quantitative
online
leap
y el
in
comercio
terms of online
electrónico, el
sales,
dinero electrónico.
e-commerce,
Y al mismo tiempo
e-banking.
se
And
dieron
at the
cuenta
same
las
time,
organizaciones que
the
tenían en su poder y que
organizations
tenían la capacidad de
realized
generar
that
una
they
gran
had the
cantidad de información, una gran
capability to
cantidad de
generate
datos
an
que
enormous
estaban
amount
quizás
of data,
previstos para otra finalidad diferente,
which might
pero
have
que
been
podían
used
ser
for other
utilizados
purposes, but which
para
could be reused
el bien común o el buen
for the
propósito de
common
combatir
good
la
in
pandemia.
order
Pero eso
to combat
implica
the
desafíos
pandemic. But
muy
that
importantes a
implies
la
tackling fairly
privacidad.
major challenges to
Porque
privacy.
estamos hablando de
We're
informaciones
talking
que
about
estaban
information
pensadas para un esquema
which was
diferente,
thought
para
up
las que los
for
titulares
a
de la información
different
habían
kind of scheme,
consentido para
so
una
that the
finalidad
owners
diferente, pero que ahora
of
se
the
estaba
information
volcando
would
para
have given their
combatir
consent to
la
something in
pandemia.
particular,
Por
but
ejemplo,
then
las redes
they
sociales
found themselves faced with a
que
different use during the
tienen mucha
pandemic.
información de carácter demográfico.
Social
Bueno, los
network
gobiernos se sirvieron de
users
esa información
and data from
para poder
these, which has an important
entender mejor cómo
demographic
era la
purpose,
composición del
the
universo
government
de
started
las
using
personas
this
afectadas,
information
o
to see how
las
people were being
compañías
affected
celulares
by the
que
pandemic, or
además de
cell
tener
phone
los datos de sus
companies,
clientes para
which in
hacer
addition to
la
have
facturación y los
the
datos de tráfico
information required for
de las comunicaciones,
invoicing,
también tienen la
began
geolocalización de los
to
usuarios, y eso
understand
les
that they
permitió también a
had
los
user
gobiernos
geolocation, which
hacer
allowed governments
el rastreo de las
to
personas
track
necesarios para combatir
people
una
in
pandemia.
order to
Pero
combat
teníamos
the
entonces datos que eran
pandemic.
utilizados para
So we're seeing
cuestiones
data
diferentes
that were
que
used for
empezaron a ser
different
utilizados para
purposes
combatir la pandemia. Entonces,
in order to combat the
ahí es
pandemic.
necesario entender que si
So
bien ese
it's
uso
important to
estaba
understand that
justificado por la
although that
propia pandemia
use
y el
was
combate contra
justified by the
el
pandemic,
virus, que no se dejaban de aplicar los principios de
that
privacidad.
they never
Entonces,
stopped applying privacy
tendremos
principles.
que volver a entender
we must
que tenemos un
understand
principio de finalidad,
that
esto
we
es,
have
podemos
a
utilizar
particular
la
end in
información
mind.
para las
We can
finalidades para las
use
cuales recolectamos,
information
pero y
for the
también para
purposes
algo
that we
compatible, y en
collected
este
it
caso cuando
and for
está
something that is
justificado por una
compatible.
pandemia
And
también
when
lo
it
podemos
is
utilizar, pero no
justified
podemos
by
utilizar
pandemic, we
la
can use
información
it,
recolectada para la pandemia, por ejemplo, para después
but we
hacer
can't
publicidad y
use
cambiarle
it
ese principio.
to
Tenemos que
do
solicitar el
targeted
consentimiento al titular
advertising
cuando
because we have to
es
request
necesario
consent
cumplir con
from
el
the
principio de seguridad de la
users because we
información,
need to
cumplir con el
comply with
principio, o
information
sea, guardar,
security
adoptar las
principles
medidas necesarias para
and the
resguardar la
principles
información de manera
required
segura,
to protect
cumplir el
people's
principio de
information and ensure it
confidencialidad y
is
no revelar
secure.
información
We have to
innecesaria,
respect confidentiality and not reveal unnecessary data.
para
These are kind of the basic
para el combate de la
tenets.
pandemia. Es decir, es necesario volver a
It
refrescar
is
todos los
necessary
principios de
to
privacidad y entender cómo
refresh
esos
the privacy
principios se
principles and
aplican a este uso
understand how
extraordinario
these apply
que tanto los
both
gobiernos
to
como las
extraordinary
organizaciones
use,
del
which
sector
was
privado
given to the data by the private
utilizaron
and public
para combatir la
sectors
pandemia.
during the pandemic.
Pablo, muchísimas gracias, muy claro.
Pablo,
Jimena,
thank you very much. That was really clear. Jimena,
nos contabas un poco del tema
Jimena,
de
you were telling
privacidad, de
us a
estándares
little bit
éticos,
about
de
privacy and ethical
los
standards,
puntos, digamos, a tener en cuenta en el diseño
the
de
points
esas
to be borne in
políticas
mind
de privacidad.
when
Yo
designing
quisiera
privacy policies.
preguntarte algo.
I wanted to ask you
Actualmente
something.
los datos ya tienen un valor en la
Currently,
medida que son
the data has a
intercambiados, o
value
generan aún más valor,
in
no
as
solamente
much
para los
as
gobiernos,
they
sino para
generate
las
value
empresas.
and are
¿Cómo
exchanged
equilibrar y
by
generar un
companies.
mercado de datos seguros que
How can you
protejan la
create a
seguridad y la
secure
privacidad de las
data
personas?
market that
Jimena?
respects people's
Gracias.
¿Qué
privacy
opinas tú?
and
Gracias, Paola.
confidentiality?
Déjame abordar esta pregunta desde dos puntos de vista.
Okay,
Primero va a ser el
let me
normativo,
address
el
these
segundo va a ser
in 2 points of view.
lo que
One,
puede
from the
pasar
point of view of
en una
regulation,
autorregulación y
and
gobernanza.
what may happen in
Desde el punto de vista
self-regulation
normativo,
and
Pablo ya
governance.
puso una
From the
data,
regulatory point of view,
yo solamente
Pablo
agregaría
gave us
esta
a
nota,
snapshot, and I would
una
like to
cuestión que
add to
atañe a
that
la
snapshot
región y al intercambio
something
comercial
that
comercial.
relates
Y
to
es
the
el
region or
convenio
involves the
108
region,
que
and that is
emitió el Consejo de Europa.
Agreement
Tiene un nombre
108
muy
issued
largo, pero
by
es
the
el
Council of
convenio
Europe,
para la
and that is
protección de
the
las
agreement
personas
for the
sujetas al
protection
tratamiento con
of people
seguridad de los
in
datos
connection with the
de todos los
automated
países.
data
Entonces, entre la
process.
región está
You
México,
have
Uruguay y
53
Argentina. Lo
countries,
que hace es fortalecer
and in the
justamente
region you
la
have
protección de
Mexico,
datos
Uruguay, and
y de la
Argentina. That
privacidad de las
protects
personas
data
en el intercambio
privacy of
automatizado de
people when
datos.
exchanging that
Además,
automated
un
process.
protocolo el cual exige que haya una
And there's a
persona
protocol
encargada
that
de crear
requires that there should be a
requisitos de este
monitor
tratado internacional.
for the
Entonces, creo que por
compliance
ahí
of this
los
international
países
agreement.
vamos.
So,
Este va para toda la
in that
región
way,
europea y para
I
todos
believe
aquellos
that this
países
is
que no son
valid
de la
for
región
the
europea
European
como
Union and those
entonces
non-European
están
countries
incluidos
that are
en este convenio
56
famoso
countries
108 y eso
that were
limita, pero
added or
pone
that joined this
una
regulation.
regulación robusta,
So
aunada a
this
toda la legislación
becomes
que acaba de
a
mencionar
robust
Pablo en esta gran
legislation that is added to a larger legislation that
Por el
Pablo
otro lado,
explained.
tenemos justamente
On the other hand,
este valor de los datos que se incrementa en la
the
medida en la que
value
hace
of this data
y hablaba
that is
justamente de estos
increased
datos no tradicionales.
is increased in line that they're protected by an agreement, and this is the data that comes from companies that holds that is holds corporations in order to create strategic plans, and the same thing goes for public policy making in governments. So what do they do? How do they go about protecting data? The first thing that you need to consider is not a mere exchange between the company and the public sector or the government. It's not only just the two stakeholders, but you have the citizenry. And there are many other stakeholders that are included in this sphere. And you may include third parties. For example, in a health situation, you have the financial aspect, the medical part, the pharmaceuticals, the hospitals, the clinics, a whole set of stakeholders that are involved in this exchange of data exchange, okay? And this is the challenge ahead of us, because as long as this information is exchanged or received, creates indeed more value and becomes more useful for companies as well as governments. However, there's exposure, especially when you have sensitive personal data, and they may become vulnerable when they are subject to distribution given the confidentiality of this information. But this should be considered because it's a way of exchanging this data. And there are challenges given that as the regulation cannot keep up, and we totally agree with what Pablo said, probably in the companies that they manage a lot of information and there's constant exchange of that and it's unstoppable, and that requires again the consent to change the end or the objective for which this data has been used, and you need to be transparent with that use of information. Probably you can create different contractual clauses with specific clauses, code of ethics or code of conducts that are signed in many corporations, and especially at the level of governments in connection with the use of this data, and to be more aggressive or proactive in data protection, precisely to have enough freedom to use that information for the benefit of corporations, because I'm not against them. As a matter of fact, they provide the service to have the gains or the earnings that they need to make, but however, they need to sign some kind of commitment to protect their citizens. And on the other hand, the government shouldn't be only the monitor or big brother that we have to fear, and then the citizens are right in the middle. So these codes of high ethics standards are signed in Estonia, in the United Kingdom, where you have a lot of data exchange and technology, and you see how there are code of conducts, code of ethics that are signed, and there are increasingly higher standards, for example, like in the European Union. There are higher standards of commitment also on the part of the users in connection, or in the companies in connection with the users. And technology should provide this, because there is development in the protection of data, and there should be a certification mechanism to protect privacy. They should see how we are going to protect aggregate data. The availability of this data shouldn't be at the expense of people's privacy or the potential use of this data. So we should have certification mechanisms, and technology in corporations and in governments should be used smartly with the necessary software in order to create these certification anonymity procedures, because there are many loopholes in anonymity as well, to protect this personal data and to aggregate this data that may be useful, but with transparency and reliability and in line with the confidentiality principles, that we could aggregate this data and that could be protected. So I believe that this is an important thing. So we shouldn't set aside cybersecurity, hacking, personal data, and all the databases are being stolen once and again, and that they are being hacked. This is concerning, and certification mechanisms should provide for that, and also the inherent risks and the challenges that are faced. Lastly, all these set of regulations require investment, because eventually companies and the state should invest in this protection. And we're speaking of international cooperation, collaboration. I mean, companies on their own cannot solve all these technological issues in favor of data exchange and privacy data protection for people. I think that this requires a macro campaign that should be more proactive in terms of international cooperation and also cooperation among companies and governments as well.
Pablo, tú hablabas ahora
Thank you.
de la
Pablo,
normatividad en los
you were speaking
gobiernos y
about
hablabas
regulations in governments,
de precisamente
standards,
en Argentina,
and precisely how they
de
were
avanzada la tecnología
prepared in
frente a
Argentina,
todos los países,
how
pero yo quisiera
technology
que nos dieras
follows
como
suit.
un esbozo muy claro de cómo estamos en Latinoamérica con respecto
Could
a
you
otros
see
países.
or analyze
¿Qué
how
países
Latin
digamos,
American
tienen
ranks
avanzados en esta materia?
compared to other advanced countries
Bueno,
in
cualquier
line
país
with these issues?
que tenga una ley que ya haya cumplido
I
más de
believe
10 años, como
any
ocurre con
country that
Argentina, que
has a
tiene,
law
que fue sancionada en el año 2000, la
that
ley de Chile, que está sancionada
was
en el año
passed more than 10 years
1999,
ago, like the
la ley de
Chilean
Colombia,
law
que es del
of
2002,
1991. I
la
think
ley
the
federal
Colombian law is from
de protección
2012.
de datos en
The
poder de los
federal
particulares de
law
México, que
of
es del
data protection in Mexico
2010,
that
si mal
dates
no
back
recuerdo. Bueno, todas
to
esas normas
2010.
seguramente tienen un
All
atraso
these laws or regulation
tecnológico
are
y
lagging
están
behind in technology,
dentro
for sure.
del paradigma
And
anterior de la protección de datos.
they
en
are
donde
within
podemos
the
hablar más de una gestión de la información que una
old
gobernanza
data
de los
protection
datos, como es
paradigm.
la
It's
corriente
not
actual
data
de
governance
las
as
regulaciones
the
más
trend
modernas
we
de
see
protección
nowadays
de
with the
datos
modern
personales.
regulation of data
Tenemos, por
protection.
ejemplo, Uruguay,
For example,
que
we have
fue
Uruguay.
sancionando
Uruguay
algunas
has passed
reformas parciales, incorporando
some
conceptos
partial
como el de la
reforms
responsabilidad
incorporating concepts
demostrada
such as the one
proactiva,
of
las evaluaciones
responsibility,
de impacto a la
the impact
privacidad,
assessments
digamos, la obligación de
affecting
reporte de los
privacy,
incidentes de seguridad,
the
que las fue
requirement
acercando
of
a los estándares
security
vigentes en cuanto a
incidents
protección de datos.
that
Desde ya
made
la
them
ley de
closely
Brasil, la
follow
LGPD,
the
está al
standards
estándar de
for
la
what was
regulación,
coming.
de las regulaciones más avanzadas.
ISPG
En
with
Ecuador
the
se
most
sancionó
advanced
una ley
regulations.
que
In
tiene
Ecuador,
una
for
vacatio
example, they
legis de
passed a
2
law
años que va a entrar en
that
vigencia.
dates
Entonces,
back to
se
2
sancionó
years
este año,
ago.
va a
I
estar
think
va a
that
entrar en vigencia
they passed it
en el
this
año
year and it's going to be
2023,
effective
que también tiene
2023.
un nivel
That
significativo
is
de avance,
very
que si bien no
significant in
está
its
a la
progress.
par de la
That even
regulación
though
europea, sí
cannot
que
keep
se
up
acerca
with the
bastante.
European Union, is very
El resto de
close.
los países,
The rest of the
realmente va a
countries,
tener que,
let
bueno,
me tell you
podemos
that
decir que
they need to
tanto
keep
México
up
como
or they need to
Colombia,
be in
a
line with
partir
these
de
new
la
advancements.
de los
Mexico
decretos
and Colombia, for
reglamentarios
example, based on
de la
the
regulación de las autoridades de
regulatory
control,
agencies
fue
and the enforcement
mejorando y
agencies,
profundizando un
has
poquito
been
más
improving
el
and
estándar
enhancing
en cuanto
the
a la
standards
protección de los datos, ya que
in
incorporan
connection
también
with
los
data
conceptos de esta
protection.
responsabilidad proactiva o demostrada.
Or,
Y
for example,
en
like
el
the
caso
proactive
de Colombia
responsibility that
también
has been
menciona
demonstrated,
en
and the
algunos
same
casos la
thing goes
evaluación
for
de
Colombia,
impacto, si bien
the impact
no
assessment that they
con,
had in Colombia.
con
Probably
la amplitud que lo hacen las
they
regulaciones más modernas, pero en
didn't do it
definitiva
as much as
entiendo
modern
yo que
regulations in the
Latinoamérica en
European
general
Union, but I believe in
tiene
Latin
que hacer
America,
un proceso
we
de
believe
avance en
that
cuanto a la protección
there
de
should
los
be
datos
more
y
progress
adecuarse a
made
los
in terms
estándares
of data
internacionales que va a
protection and
resultar
try
no
to
solamente como
keep
mencioné
up with the
en
modern
beneficio para los
standards
particulares,
that
sino
is going to
también
result
para
in
las propias
benefits for
organizaciones que
individuals
van a
and
tener un modelo
also
de
for the
gobernanza de
organizations
datos
that are going to
como
have a more
parámetro y
comprehensive
para implementar que estaría
data
resultando en un beneficio para
governance
todos.
model that is going to result into
Pablo,
a
gracias.
benefit for all
Jimena,
eventually.
hablabas tú
Thank you,
ahora
Pablo.
precisamente
Jimena,
de que no había
we were speaking
consenso internacional
of the
y
lack
que
of consensus,
esto me
the lack of
imagino nos
consensus
irá a
at the
afectar en la
international level.
transferencia internacional de los datos. ¿Cuál es tu punto de vista desde ese
What is your point of view? What is your opinion of the lack of consensus on data protection? Okay, at the end of the day, data exchange, privacy, and data governance lies in a conflict of interest for many stakeholders because the government pursues public design, corporations' earnings, and the citizenry seeks protection and privacy and anonymity. Now, this framework is very complex because there's a stringent regulation on the part of the government with its enforcement. For example, Europe has strengthened data protection as the is PI, and that sets the course to where to go with Agreement 108. However, we need to analyze the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the OECD, agreements, international covenants protecting private life, for example. And on the one hand, there we have an idea of intervention on regulation and also this data governance that may strike a balance with the conflicts of interest. And this could be addressed by many other means, responsibilities, transparency, as Pablo said. If you see the last international conferences where they include the topics of platform developers, government, and e-commerce, that's the issue. There's no convergence between the regulatory framework because there are different interests that are being targeted and we need convergence. And let us not forget the United States, because sometimes we resort to Europe and to the European regulations, Agreement 108, all the regulations in Latin America, that I'm sure that we're going to make progress that in terms of regulations. However, the United States appears as a blank that doesn't have a specific regulation. Yes, they don't have a data protection law, and consumers do not speak of privacy. However, they were the pioneers to develop the concept of privacy, or goods as privacy. For example, in the United Kingdom, it dates back to the 1800s. And the way to decide whether to have children or not, and how privacy was involved in their private lives, that was a very important case in the case law of the United States. But the development of privacy is very important for them, and there's public interest with the intervention, for example, with the Twin Towers or the terrorist attacks, because that is very significant, and there may be not so much regulation in the legal system. And right now we're going towards paying attention to the United States, to its resolutions, what the International Court of Justice is saying in connection with privacy, because it's the main player. We're going to see how the court is supervising Facebook, for example, in America, or the Google's, or those internet companies that are very important. And there they manage the idea of privacy and interoperability with data and with corporations. So I believe that is one of the stakeholders that we should follow. Good. I think that our time is up, and Pablo contributed many interesting comments. The same thing with Jimena. Important phrases like empowerment of data, the ability of sharing this data and the value of it, and the lack of having this legal framework for data protection. Pablo was saying to have a data official responsible for monitoring these data processing companies. I really like the panel today. What you said is very interesting for corporations and for technology developers and for all the stakeholders, because this goes hand in hand with privacy, with data protection, and with data management. Olga, are there any further questions in the Q&A there? The comments coming from the students are that, you know, has been very clear, very interesting, very exciting. We should have more days. However, we have just a few minutes left for the Q&As that are posted, for the questions posted. What is the the responsibility of transnational companies when we are coming up with a data protection law here locally or domestically. Are there any countries at the subnational level, for example, municipalities? Are there any examples? What is the source of the map that you screened? Later, we would like to know the source because, for example, the United States had a blank in terms of regulations, and Jimena explained that. Also, another question for Pablo is, there's genuine interest on the part of users for data use. Are we at the disposal of private data service providers? GRPD is not the only consent because there are all sorts of consents and agreements. Then another comment, how do you guarantee citizenry empowerment in connection with the use of information when we speak of IoT, Internet of Things? And the United States was not included in the map. Another comment. Let me see. Social media consent provides social media, and we are losing privacy when we write that consent. How are we going to create a culture of data protection, as well as so it's more or less along the same lines. There are many comments in favor of this topic. I totally agree with you. Are there any other comments, Pablo or Jimena, that you would like to add in connection with these questions?
Pablo, Jimena, ¿quién quiere empezar?
Pablo, Jimena.
Jimena, ¿querés arrancar vos? Yo, a ver, comentarios vinculados al mapa.
Some questions in connection with the map. Let me tell you that the source, it was cited in my presentation, is David Bannister. David Bannister is a professional specialist on privacy, and every single year has been updating this map and is an authority on this matter. Also, you can visit other databases or websites to process this information. It is true that based on the European regulation on data protection and also the general law of Brazil and now the law in Ecuador, and apart from the consent, they are adding the legal database of legitimate use of the internet, users, contractual obligations between the parties. So they extend the scope of legitimate interest. They go beyond the consent of data ownership, the legal basis on which we should process this in a personal way. So it should be necessary to resort to the consent in the case of sensitive data, but also, for example, in the case of contractual obligations or employment, probably the consent is not that clear, and the responsible party that receives the data should process this information as personal data more transparently or in line with some regulations. But in Latin America, the only thing that we have consent is consent, and we should add some regulatory basis so that we can include other more appropriate legal basis beyond just having ownership of that information or the holder of the right of that information.
Sí, muchas gracias. A ver, hay un par de preguntas que me gustaría contestar.
Yeah, I would like to take a couple of questions that were asked. The first one deals with the subnational regulations. In Mexico, we had a general law for subjects of law. So you set the principles, the standards, and the regulation, And then you have different districts, okay, where this law is enforced. And then you have local law. INAI, that is the organization that sets these rules, has state-owned regulations, that is a subnational regulation. So we have different competences in the legal aspect, and you have the data protection regulation for individuals in that case. So Mexican law basically opens the gap between private and public sector, and in the public sector, it creates a cascade effect of subnational regulations, so they could have their own training institutes and personal data institutes at the subnational level. One of the questions that was asked was about re-empowerment. The common trend has been the reuse or redistribution of data, and this data basically change hands constantly. So this data governance law right now precisely provides for regulating the reuse of the redistribution of data, so the owner basically can determine who should be using this data in line with the human rights, because there is exposure, so we are subject to reusing that information or crossing that information, and it may be subject to discrimination when probably you're requiring an employment form, or probably when you are filling out some form in the health sector. So we are looking for or pursuing some data exchange mechanism, and people that are providing their consent should be able to stop this when preventing others from using or precluding others from using their own information. So citizens will have to sit on the negotiation table right now, and the state has the enforcement role and the human rights protection, and corporations play the role of confidentiality or transparency. The three stakeholders who sit at the negotiation table with their own proactive stance. Before we didn't have that. Basically, we recourse privacy only, and we knew that the use of personal data could be used at any time, even though there was consent. Right now, reuse is not enough, and I've been gathering information and analyzing the consent of personal data, and also sensible data that becomes vulnerable sometimes or infringed, and that requires express consent unless if it's of public interest. But this is overwhelmed. There are many things here considered as goods. And are we at the mercy of data, as you said in one of the questions? I don't want to argue that corporations own this data and we are at their mercy. We shouldn't be unfair when saying that. But there are issues of cybersecurity and violations, but we are requiring confidentiality and data protection. I believe that is very important. We shouldn't be or fall victims of large corporations. It's not that it's good to argue that. However, we should demand that personal data or confidentiality of data. So this is an exchange. The relation between data and user has been transformed because of technology. we shouldn't get sidetracked. I think that we are losing sight of what is going on right now. I believe that we should focus on responsibility, transparency, and demanding confidentiality of personal data. And we should pursue these principles. I believe that I don't know if there are any questions. Is that okay? Thank you very much. No, you've been very, very clear. That's okay. Thank you for being so kind to take all these questions from the audience. There were many, many comments and many, many questions that were similar. This has been a very interesting panel, expressing their own views from the academic and business point of view, and from the public sector as well. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for your time. I know that you have a busy agenda, but hopefully we could find you, or we can find you in person or face to face in some other countries in Latin America or in Argentina. And for now, let's keep in touch virtually. And if you want to stay tuned, you can do it in Zoom or in YouTube. And later on, we're going to send you links to see all the presentation. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thanks. My pleasure, Olga.
Gracias. Felicidades por el evento.
Keep in touch. Congratulations on your conference.
Ustedes y los becarios.